So I think we are going on right now. So, hello, nice to everyone. Nice to see you, everyone. Today is a great opportunity to have here someone not local. I know that you're normally used to have someone from the Czech Republic, but today here with us is someone I really admire, someone very special, and you can see him in the middle. It's a Scott Ritter. Hello, Scott. Can we hear each other well? Is everything working?
I hear you fine. Hopefully you can hear me as well.
Yes, and let's add some information for you. This video is going to be in English for you, but you all the time will see subtitles down. So no problem for you. You will understand everything. What is amazing, I'm really thankful to Henry, to Jindřich here, because he provided this interview. So Jindřich, thank you very much for this opportunity and how it will work here. So some brief information for you guys. I will ask Scott questions from you. You sent a lot of questions, different questions. Some questions, they just were really similar, very the same. So I tried to choose questions really to hear different opinions. The second thing, this is not TV. So we will speak freely. We will say our opinions. You will hear different perspective, different points of view. I know that you're very interested in conflict in Ukraine, so we will talk about it. Let's say some things before we start. What is the goal of this video or this discussion? Is just to provide you some information from someone who is very experienced and had and has a great career. I will tell you more about Scott soon. What is very important for you to know is that all the questions are from different people, from different backgrounds. So I tried to not to, put some way. They are very different. So be ready for that. And next thing for you is that you can debate under this video. You can have different opinion. You can have a different, point of view. So don't be shy. Just discuss it with other people below. It's okay. You can tell your opinion. And now let's tell something about you, Scott. If you feel that you want to add something, just feel free to add it. So who is Scott Ritter? Scott, I took this information from Wikipedia. So really, if you feel something you want to add, just do it. Scott Ritter is a weapons inspector, writer, and lecturer. Worked with United Nations weapons inspector in Iraq within 1991 till 1998. News analyst for CNN and NBC television networks. Producer of documentary film Shifting Sands, The Truth About Iraq. It was in 2000. Military service, you worked and attained rank of major. You later became a critic of United States foreign policy in the Middle East. You served with the United Nations implementing arms control treaties during Operation Desert Storm and in Iraq, overseeing the disarmament of weapons of mass destruction. Sorry for my English, guys. It's 6 o'clock in the morning in Vietnam. If it's not perfect, just forgive me. Yeah, let's say, Scott, is it okay for you? Would you add something?
I'll say this. Who am I? Look, I'm as human as everybody else. I was the child of a military officer. I grew up overseas. I went to 3 different high schools, one in Hawaii, one in Turkey, and I graduated in Germany. I went to college. I studied Russian history. I joined the Marine Corps. I got my commission in the Marine Corps in 1984 as an intelligence officer. And I spent the first couple years learning how to kill Russians. I mean, it's a Cold War, and the Soviet Union was the enemy, and we were preparing for war with the Soviet Union. And we prepared very intensely. It was I guess it was real training. It's not fake training, real stuff. Fortunately, I was never compelled to do that against the Soviet target. Instead, because of my Russian history background, I was selected to serve as an inspector in the Soviet Union, implementing the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, getting rid of nuclear weapons. And I spent 2 years working outside of a Soviet missile factory in Vodkinsk, about 750 miles east of Moscow, in the foothills of the Ural Mountains. And that was literally one of the highlights of my military career, was that opportunity. When that finished, I got a chance to use my military training because we went to war against Iraq, and I served in Iraq, or in Saudi Arabia, under General Schwarzkopf's staff. Because of my experience with missiles, I was given the counter Scud portfolio, and I spent the war working with special forces, the Air Force, and others to try and kill Iraqi Scuds before they could be fired against Israel or Saudi Arabia. The war ended. I had what's called a good war. That means that I didn't get killed, and whatever I did, people were happy with. And because of my background as an intelligence officer, arms control, the important thing about what I did in the Soviet Union was we wrote the book on on-site inspection. Before what we did in the Soviet Union, no one ever did on-site inspection. Nobody knew what it was. We wrote the book. And so the United Nations had a problem after the Gulf War that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, and they needed to locate them and get rid of them. So they brought me in as an intelligence officer who wrote the book on on-site inspections, who knew something about Iraqi missiles. Yeah. And I was I participated in that project as a chief inspector for 7 years, and I went to Iraq over 40 times, and I think we accomplished our job. The problem was there's a lot of politics involved in it. And in the end, I ended up resigning my position from the Special Commission because I disagreed with the American approach, which was more triggered towards getting rid of Saddam Hussein than getting rid of weapons of mass destruction. And I've been critical of U.S. policy ever since then. But being critical of U.S. policy doesn't make me anti-American. I'm as pro-American as you can get. I put on the uniform, prepared to die for my country, and I'm still prepared to die for my country. And if somebody threatens my country, I can become a Marine real quick. But one of the great things about being an American, in my standpoint, is that the government works for me. I don't work for the government, and I get to hold the government accountable for what it does in my name. And when the government does things that deviate from the norms and values that we claim to represent as a nation, when we carry out a foreign policy that lacks integrity, it's my responsibility, especially if I have expertise. I mean, when we talk about arms control, I know a little bit about arms control. So when I look at my government's policy about arms control and I think that it's deviated from the what we have done in the past, I have a duty and responsibility as an American citizen to speak out. And the same thing with military affairs, the current situation in Ukraine. I have some expertise in large-scale ground combat. And I know a little bit about the Russian military. And when I take a look at what's happening in Ukraine, I realize that my government, Ukrainian government, and the European governments weren't telling the truth about what's going on, how this war started, and what's going on in Ukraine today. So I felt compelled to speak out. So that's what I'm doing. It's my responsibility as an American citizen, and frankly speaking, as a global citizen, to do this. So that's why I'm very grateful for you having me on here and to have the opportunity to engage in this conversation.
Yeah, we are honored, Scott. Just before we go to Ukraine, I think it was you said it very clearly. You're not anti-American. You're just criticizing the government and its policies, which is completely different. These are two different things. So just before we jump on Ukraine, you became famous of criticizing the second Iraqi war. Because you are saying that there are no weapons of mass destruction, that they have no facilities to manufacture weapons of mass destruction. And later on, I have also realized that you are criticizing the policy in Syria, because you said that there was no chemical attack in Syria, and I think a lot of people called you conspiracy theories because of that. But in the end, I believe there was you were right on all of the occasions. And the world still thinks that there were chemical attacks in Syria, but I'm super convinced that it was not the case. So maybe if you can just briefly speak about these two things, because that made you famous, and you basically went against the mainstream, but in the end you were proven right. So that's I think the most important stuff.
Yeah, in Iraq, I spent 7 years as the lead intelligence professional in the United Nations. That means that every nation in the world went through me to provide information about in Iraq. And then I was the lead inspector for many of these issues in Iraq. So I would receive the information, I would build an inspection, then I would lead the inspection into Iraq, and then I would return. And then the cycle would begin again. I was also the guy that traveled to all the nation capitals and dealt with the senior government officials. So I would brief the British government on inspections. I would brief the German government. I would brief the French government. I would brief the Dutch government, the Israeli government, and I would go to the White House. I would go to the State Department. So I wasn't some little puny person. I was very much at the center of everything that was happening. So when I resigned and said that the case for war is exaggerated, that we could account for 95, 97% of Iraq's weapons of mass destruction. We know that they're eliminated, and that we could mitigate against concerns about the unaccounted for material by noting that we were monitoring the totality of Iraq's industrial infrastructure. My problem was, how do you claim now that Iraq has weapons of mass destruction? Do you have some new information? And when the U.S. government admitted in 1999, 2000 that they didn't have any new information, they were simply reevaluating the old information, that meant that I knew everything the U.S. government knew, which means the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and I was saying it as loudly as I could. Unfortunately, we see the control that government has over mainstream media and the ability of government to shape a narrative. When you have the one guy who knows everything about Iraq's weapons of mass destruction telling you there are no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, not being believed because the government has decided to have somebody contradict me who has never been in Iraq, doesn't know how to spell WMD, etc. We have a problem when the people tend to believe anybody but me. As you said, history proved me right, but you know what? That's not good enough. Being proven right after the fact isn't good enough, because we went to war on a lie. Yeah. Thousands of Americans died. Hundreds of thousands of Iraqis died. Millions of Iraqis suffered because of a lie. So maybe I didn't do a good enough job trying to convince people. And I've always looked back on that and said, what more could I have done to do a better job of educating people? Again, that's why when you said you want to talk, I said, hell yeah, I want to talk, because having this kind of discussion hopefully will generate, debate and dialogue, and people start to question the official narrative and draw their own opinions. Because I didn't do a good enough job back in 2002, 2003. I failed because we went to war, even though I knew the truth. On Syria, I wasn't in Syria, but I know a couple things about inspections, and I know a couple things about chemical weapons. And I took a look at the entire narrative that was put together, and I said, this ain't right. It's like, I don't want to give myself too much credit, but it's like a brain surgeon. Once you're a brain surgeon, you know a little bit about the brain, you know about brain surgery, and you may have retired, but now if somebody comes on TV and they're talking about brain surgery and you're going, no, that ain't brain surgery. No, we don't do it that way. No, that's not how the brain functions. I think you're able to say, hey, I got a problem with what they're saying because that's wrong. So when I listen to what people are talking about, the Syrian chemical weapons program and the attacks and stuff, I went, this isn't right. Something, for instance, there was a village that got bombed by a Syrian aircraft, an Su-22, Khan Shaykhun, I think it was. And they're showing the radar track of the airplane as it comes in. And I'm following the radar track. Now, I happen to have a background in aviation. I flew OV-10s and OA-4s. I know about dropping bombs. I know how airplanes work, military aircraft, delivering munitions. And I know that when you drop a bomb, it doesn't magically divert in flight and end up pointing in another direction. When they say the airplane came in this way, but the bomb was facing this way, I said, nah, that didn't come from that aircraft. Can't. It's impossible. Plus, I looked at the whole flight parameters. It didn't happen. But when you bring this up, people are like, "Oh, you're a conspiracy theorist." I said, "There's no conspiracy here. Physics is physics. A bomb being dropped from an airplane is physics decides where it's going to go. And if it's somewhere else, then that airplane didn't drop that bomb." And we can tear the story apart over and over again. So I felt that I needed to speak out because clearly the official narrative was a lie. And also the thing you need to understand is the people telling the lie are the same people that told the lie last time for the same reasons. So, it's not like you can lie about Iraq and suddenly we're supposed to believe you about everything else. I think we have a duty and responsibility to be very skeptical about the information, especially when the information doesn't add up. So, yeah, I spoke out against Iraq. I spoke out against Syria. And I'm speaking out against Ukraine today.
Yes. Yeah, well, that's marvelous. I just wanted to before we go to the questions of our viewers, just one question, because I think in the the beginning base of all of this stuff is the cause of the conflict, like why this is happening. So if you are looking at Ukraine, what is your opinion? What is the main cause of the war, of the current situation?
The main cause of the war is NATO expansion. End of story. If it weren't for NATO expansion, there wouldn't be a war in Ukraine today, because everything follows from that. NATO expansion encompasses a lot of things. It encompasses not just the physical expansion of NATO from 12, 13, 14 to now 30 members, but the mindset behind it. NATO expansion incorporates a total disrespect for Russia. A total disregard for agreements that had been made between Mikhail Gorbachev and Western leaders about the expansion of NATO. Not 1 inch eastward, the Russians were told. Not 1 inch. Oh, no, they didn't go 1 inch. They went a couple hundred miles. The absolute disregard for Russia. NATO expansion also encompasses the redefinition of what NATO is, from a defensive alliance to an alliance now that is capable of taking on offensive, preemptive military action. One only has to look at the history of what happened in with Serbia and Kosovo to understand that NATO is not a defensive alliance. NATO carried out a war of aggression against Serbia. One only has to take a look at what NATO did against Libya, a war of aggression designed for regime change. Take a look at NATO's presence in Afghanistan. Why is an organization called the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, North Atlantic, sort of defines the geographical dimensions of this organization? Why are they in Afghanistan? Why is NATO today talking about a presence in the Pacific? Because they're an expansive, aggressive organization. And this is a mindset. This mindset led NATO to invite former republics of the Soviet Union, Ukraine and Georgia, to join NATO in 2008. Russia made it clear at that time that this was a red line, that they weren't going to allow this. And that's not speculation on my part. A guy named William Burns, who today is the director of the CIA, in 2008, he was the ambassador of the United States to Russia. In February 2009, he wrote a memorandum called "Niet means niet," no means no, meaning when the Russians say no expansion into Ukraine, they mean no expansion. You know what he said? If we continue with this policy, he said, there will be a war in Ukraine, and Ukraine will lose Crimea, and they will lose the Donbass. Wow. So we knew what we were getting into, we being the West. We knew exactly what the consequences were, and yet we did it anyways. NATO expansion also deals with things such as regime change in Russia. Now you say, wait a minute, regime change, come on, that's a conspiracy. You can't be talking. Well, you remember 2009, the reset? The red button, cute little red button that Hillary Clinton presented to Sergei Lavrov. It was wrong. It was something different.
He said push the button.
Right. Well, the thing about the reset is what did it symbolize? The reset was the brainchild of Michael McFaul. In 2009, he was advising. He's a Stanford professor, Russian area expert, who was advising Obama on the National Security Council about Russian affairs. Prior to Obama coming in, something happened in Russia. They have a constitution. Imagine that, the rule of law. And the Russian president, Vladimir Putin, was constrained by the constitution to only having 2 consecutive terms. So Putin did a little trick. He switched places with Dmitry Medvedev. Medvedev was the prime minister. Medvedev became the president. Putin became the prime minister. You know, we can talk about democracy and is this right? Who cares? It's Russia's business, not my business. But Dmitry Medvedev is now president. So what was the reset about? The reset was about the United States taking advantage of Putin's absence as president to reach out to Dmitry Medvedev and say, we are willing to improve relations with Russia as long as you stay president. Putin can never come back into the Kremlin. He's done. That's called regime change. And we know this is the case. In 2011, then Vice President Joe Biden, familiar name, he's the President of the United States today, flew to Moscow and had a meeting with, imagine this, Russian opposition figures. So he's speaking to the Russian political opposition. And he says, if I were Vladimir Putin, I wouldn't run for office, run for president again. It'll be bad for Putin. It'll be bad for Russia. Sounds like a threat to me. Sounds like interference in the domestic political affairs of a sovereign nation. Putin doesn't care what Joe Biden said then. I don't think he cares about what Joe Biden says now. Putin ran for election, and he won. In March of 2012, he won the election. This angered the United States furiously. And since that time, they've been working overtime to undermine Russia, undermine Putin. And a key element of undermining Russia and Putin was to strip Ukraine away from the Russian sphere of influence. And the best way to strip Ukraine away was twofold. One, to get Ukraine to join the European Union, as opposed to be remaining in the Russian economic orbit. And the other one was to get Ukraine to join NATO. Both of these were red lines. Now, the Russians actually yielded on the European Union. They said, you want to join the European Union? Join the European Union, but we're not paying for it. And Ukraine realized they couldn't afford to join the European Union. So their president at the time, I think Viktor Yanukovych, said, we're going to stick with the Russian orbit. Then a demonstration began in 2013, carried on in 2014. Initially, it was a peaceful demonstration, but somewhere in January, February 2014, something happened. It turned violent. It turned violent because the United States unleashed the Ukrainian nationalists. Wait a minute, Scott, that's a conspiracy theory. Really? The CIA has admitted that from 1945 to 1990, it funded the Bandera movement, the organization of Ukrainian nationalists. They funded them. They funded them initially to carry out military operations. Now, people say military operations. They're just Ukrainian nationalists. Of course, they're opposed to Stalin and the Soviets. Except during that time, they killed over 120,000 Polish civilians. They killed over 100,000 Russian civilians. No, they're not against the Soviets. They're against anybody who's not Ukrainian. They're Ukrainian nationalists. They're very racist. They believe in the supremacy of the Ukrainian nationality. And so they killed these subhumans, the Poles and the Russians. Fortunately for the world, the Russian military, the Soviet military defeated them. But as a political movement, they survived both in Ukraine and outside of Ukraine, funded by the CIA. The CIA maintained close relations with these people. In 2014, the CIA unleashed Ukrainian nationalists, turned the anti-Yanukovych demonstrations into a violent demonstration. It became a coup d'etat, a violent coup d'etat carried out by these virulent neo-Nazi nationalists who now seized control in Kiev, and then began a genocidal movement against ethnic Russians and Russian speakers. They went to Odessa, stuffed 150 pro-Russian demonstrators into a trade union building, set it on fire, killed nearly 50 of them. Then they unleashed themselves on the Donbass. The reason why the Azov regiment's called the Azov regiment is because they moved into Mariupol on the Azov, and they began to terrorize the ethnic Russians who now rose up against them, starting the crisis. Now we say, well, what's NATO got to do with that? Well, fortunately for us, unfortunately for the Ukrainians, a former president named Poroshenko came out and made an amazing statement. Because you see, after the Donbass rose up and there was this fighting, the world tried to stop this fight. Russia wanted to stop it. You know, the Russians that rose up in the Donbass originally said, hey, we want to secede from Ukraine and become Russian. And Putin said, no, you're Ukrainian. We were going to respect the territorial integrity of Ukraine. Imagine that. A Russian president said that, and he meant it. He said, we're going to have Minsk Accords. We're going to agree to these Minsk Accords, which means we're going to negotiate a settlement that gives you autonomy, respects Russian rights, but you're still part of Ukraine. But the Ukrainians never ratified this. The Germans and the French said, hey, we're going to encourage them to ratify it, but they never did. From 2014, 2022, 8 years, nothing happened. Why? Poroshenko just gave it away. He said, we were never going to ratify Minsk. The whole purpose of Minsk was to buy time so that NATO could train the Ukrainian army to have the capability of launching an offensive that would take over the Donbass and Crimea. So NATO was involved in a plan with the Ukrainians to use Minsk as a vehicle to buy time until a military was trained. Now you say conspiracy theory, Ritter, No, NATO put a permanent base on the soil of Ukraine. The United States Army brags about the fact that every 55 days it trained a new battalion of Ukrainian forces to NATO standards, who were then sent to eastern Ukraine to fight the Russians, to kill the Russians. The Americans bragged about it. We're fighting them over there, they said, but we don't have to fight them here. We were part of this. We knew what we wanted. We knew we wanted war. But when people say, who's responsible for this conflict? NATO's responsible. The United States is responsible. Europe is responsible. Well, wait a minute. Didn't Russia invade? Isn't that the way it worked? Yeah, it did. But the amazing thing about the Russian invasion is that it's about as legal as it can get. You're a lawyer. You know, you understand these things. The Russians are very clever legally. The Donbass was Ukrainian, which means that Russia, under its own constitution, really can't get involved. But then, because they refused to ratify Minsk, the Lugansk and Donetsk People's Republic declared their independence. And Russia recognized their independence. Now they're sovereign entities. Now Russia can engage in something called collective security. Russia didn't invent this. You know who invented the concept of collective security in terms of supporting preemptive military action? NATO. They did it against Serbia in Kosovo. So Russia simply took the NATO playbook and applied it to Ukraine. They carried out a preemptive defensive attack against the Ukrainian military, which was literally amassing 60 to 80,000 troops for building up in eastern Ukraine to launch an attack that was supposed to begin in March against the Russian separatists in Donbass. So Russia launched a preemptive strike. This is totally legal under Article 51 of the United Nations Charter. Completely legal. But the world ignores that. They say Russia brutally invaded Ukraine without any provocation. No, there was huge provocation. And Russia carried out legitimate collective self-defense to stop NATO and Ukraine from fulfilling the plan that Poroshenko has acknowledged, the building up of Ukrainian military by NATO as a proxy of NATO to launch an attack against Russia in the Donbass and Crimea.
Here is a question following. This is from Vladimir Novotny. I will say in English for you. Do you think, Scott, is Ukraine a U.S. money launderer? Did they remove Trump because of this? Do you see any pre-war connection between Zelensky and the U.S. government?
If there was a connection between the Ukrainian government and the Democratic Party in the United States,
look, we know there is. I mean, you don't have to be a conspiracy theorist. First of all, when Joe Biden's son Hunter, who has no qualifications whatsoever, gets invited on the board of Burisma, you have to ask yourself what's going on here. Yeah, it's an enrichment scheme for Hunter Biden, but it's also about Burisma taking advantage of connectivity with Joe Biden to get the United States to support policies that enrich Burisma and Burisma board members. So it's a giant money laundering scheme. There is a Ukrainian whose name is slipping my mind, begins with a P, but he runs a think tank type organization. Used to be run out of Crimea. Now that the Russians have Crimea, it's elsewhere. But he was very closely linked to Hillary Clinton and the Clinton Foundation. He provided significant financial backing for that. The Ukrainians have connectivity at the highest levels of the Democratic Party, and Donald Trump, I think, saw this and was trying to enact policies that responded to this, and the system turned on him. I mean, the impeachment was empowered by a CIA agent working in the National Security Council who illegally leaked information about a phone call that was taken out of perspective, and he was conspiring with a active duty military officer, Alexander Vindman, who was working inside the National Security Council, to again leak this information illegally to lawyers, to the media, to anybody, to create a scandal. They worked with Adam Schiff, and next thing we know, we have impeachment over a phone call that Donald Trump was making because of concerns he had about the corrupt actions of Joe Biden and his son, Hunter Biden. Now, could Trump have been smarter in how he dealt with this? I think so. I think a more experienced politician would have been able to navigate these waters, these shark-filled waters. Trump wasn't smart, and Trump ended up, getting caught up in this scandal. But this scandal was all about defending the Democrats from the accusations being made by Donald Trump. Anybody today that takes the time to study the linkage between the Democrats and Ukrainians would have to understand that there is definitely connectivity there. Is it the main engine that's driving this boat? No. Corruption often isn't the main engine. Corruption often takes place on the periphery, where people take advantage. Take a look at the photographs of all the Obama era experts on Ukraine. Every time they visited Ukraine, they all got the photograph of them at a Ukrainian energy installation wearing a Burisma jacket. I mean, Evelyn Farkas, ask her about the photograph that she has. All the other officials have the same photographs. Why? Why, if you're a U.S. government official, do you have to wear a Burisma jacket and go to one of these facilities? What's going on there? Is that really in the interest of the national security of the United States? Or are you part and parcel of a scheme where we exploit the corrupt nature of Ukraine to enrich our and enrich our partners?
Well, I remember the famous video where Joe Biden is bragging about, like calling the Ukrainian president and saying him, if the state attorney is not fired within 6 hours, you lose all your financial support, which is
son of a bitch.
Exactly. I mean, how the U.S. official can threaten a sovereign state that they will lose all of the financial support if they don't fire their own state attorney who was in that time investigating Burisma. This is crazy.
No, look, the whole thing is literally, if I were an editor at a major publishing house and somebody presented me a novel where this was the premise of the novel, I'd say it's not realistic, man. No, come on. This could never happen. It would never happen. The truth literally is stranger than fiction.
You will tell him, make it more realistic. Come on.
More realistic, yeah. Nobody can be that corrupt.
So, guys, I'm going to put here a new question, and it's again a little different question, but it's connected with the theme we are talking about. This concerns a lot of people in Czech Republic right now, Scott. Russia called the Czech Republic an enemy for actively supporting Ukraine. Are we in danger? What does it mean, according to you?
The enemies list put out by Russia is purely a political gimmick. Because Russia, I think the cause and effect relationship is actually that Russia was labeled an enemy by the Czech Republic first. They were part of this European piling on Russia. Is the Czech Republic in danger? Not from Russia, not directly. Russia's not going to invade the Czech Republic. This ain't going to be Prague 1968. That just isn't going to happen. Unless, of course, Czechoslovakia decides to throw its weight behind NATO intervention in Ukraine. And then all bets are off. If there's a general war between Russia and Ukraine and NATO, you sow the wind, you reap the whirlwind. Okay, and people need to understand that. But Russia right now, I believe Russia is going to limit this military operation to the borders of Ukraine. It's not going to extend beyond it unless NATO wants to extend it. If NATO wants a fight, as Putin said, okay, we can do that. You think you can beat us? Why don't you try? But NATO can't beat Russia. It's just plain and simple. But Russia's not looking. Go ahead.
I heard where you were. So we have some problem with the sound. I heard your speech where you are saying that basically NATO is provoking Russia to go to war, and you are saying that if there is an open war in Europe between NATO and Russia, that NATO will flat out lose this war. So
flat out lose. Ask your Czech generals. How much ammunition you got, guys? Seriously. How many artillery pieces do you have? First of all, how many of them work?
Not too many.
Yeah. Not too many, but how many of them work? How many have actually been trained? Have you trained on them lately? Are you guys really good at this? Okay, and now you're going to get into a war with a country that actually believes in artillery. I mean, in a big way. The Russians love artillery. They got a lot of them. And they apparently have an endless amount of ammunition because they're firing 60 to 75,000 rounds a day. I don't know if the Czech Republic has 75,000 rounds in totality. Who knows? But NATO will run out of ammunition in 2 weeks in a war with Russia. 2 weeks, you run out of ammunition. And then it's over, guys. Okay, it's over. Do svidaniya. There's not much you can do about it. So it would be stupid and foolhardy for NATO at this point. And why did NATO get to this point? Because there was a time when NATO, had the resources to carry out sustained conflict with the Soviet Union, but they allowed their capabilities to dissipate. Europe became addicted to the peace dividend. You stopped investing in your military. You reduced your military. What military you had, you put into barracks and you didn't train. When was the last time you actually turned on the engines of all your tanks and make sure they work, make sure they can drive? You have the spare parts to maintain them. And it's not just the Czech Republic. The Germans are horrible. The big, vaunted German military could barely get a reinforced battalion to deploy to Lithuania. The British, they used to have 80 to 90,000 troops in the British Army on the Rhine during the Cold War. Now they have 72,000 troops altogether. They were barely able to get a battalion to send up to Estonia. Now Jan Stoltenberg in Madrid said, "Hey, we want you to beef that up to a brigade size." The British are like, well, "We don't have a brigade." That's just the reality of it. But the threat to the Czech Republic isn't from the Russian military. The threat to the Czech Republic is Czech politicians. All right. What's going to hurt Czechoslovakia this winter is the fact that the Czechs have signed on to these sanctions, which have crippled Europe's economy and the Czech economy as well. Where are you going to get your gas? I don't know. I mean, that's a Czech problem. But, and even if the Czechs can solve that problem, are your neighbors going to solve it? When you're part of the European Union, you're part of an economic union, which means if half of the union collapses, the other half's not going to do well either. So the Czech Republic's not insulated here. This is where the Czech Republic's going to get hurt. And it's not because Russia wants to hurt the Czech Republic. It's because the Czech politicians have put the Czech Republic in a place where they're literally going to have some serious economic problems. And people need to understand that when industries shut down, sometimes they don't reopen. This isn't going to be a planned, careful, coordinated shutdown. It's going to shut down because there's no gas, there's no energy. We got to shut down. It's not profitable. We got to lay off everybody now. Lights are out. And you just don't walk right back into that because your labor force now is dissipated. Your workers are going to be desperately looking for other jobs elsewhere. Your equipment's not going to be maintained properly. It's over. And some German economists have said that if the things continue on the track that they are, Germany's going to be suffering great economic damage that it hasn't seen since the end of the Second World War. Well, my God, we bombed Germany into the Stone Age in the Second World War. So the guy's saying basically that because Germany signed on to these sanctions against Russia, the harm that will befall Germany will be the equivalent of being bombed by Allied bombers during the Second World War. Well, guess what, Czech Republic? You're about to get bombed by Allied bombers, but it's not really. It's the own stupidity of your politicians that have put you in this situation. I'm not saying that the Czech Republic has to blindly support Russia, but you have to be realistic about the totality of the picture. You don't have to say that Russia it's okay that Russia invaded Ukraine. You're allowed to say no, we're not good with that. You know what? And that's okay because it's not a good thing. Anytime one country invades another is not a good thing. It would have been nice if a diplomatic solution could have been out there. But did the Czech Republic really do everything possible to get a diplomatic solution, or did they just play the NATO game? Did the Czech ambassador to NATO sit there at the table and pound his fist and say, we must do everything possible to make sure Russia doesn't invade Ukraine, which means we have to treat seriously the Russian proposition about a new European security framework? Can we at least talk about that? Or did he sit there and nod dumbly every time Jan Stoltenberg said, we're going to do what the Americans tell us to do? I think it's probably that he was nodding dumbly. And now you're paying the price. And at some point in time, I say this to everybody, this war is going to end. One way or another, it's going to end. It's probably going to end in a decisive Russian victory, but it's going to end. What is Czech Republic doing about that time period? Is the Czech Republic working to find an off-ramp off of this path towards confrontation? Are they figuring out how they can resume normal diplomatic relations with Russia, to normalize economic interaction with Russia? Or is the Czech Republic just being stupid and following the United States wherever it tells them to go, including if that means jumping off the cliff like a bunch of dumb lemmings following each other as they go on their suicidal trek? I don't mean to be critical here, but I'm critical of all of Europe. I think Europe has failed itself. It's high time Europeans start looking out for Europeans. It's time to stop thinking that the United States cares about you. We don't. We don't care about you at all. We like to visit you. Prague's a beautiful city. Czech Republic's beautiful. I love the concept of tourism. I've been to Prague. Great beer, good music. I mean, nice place to visit. But at the end of the day, the American people, first of all, most of them couldn't point out Prague on a map. I don't mean to be insulting, but they don't know where the Czech Republic is. They don't know much about Europe. They don't care about France. They don't care about Germany. They don't care about Norway. They don't care about Italy unless they're visiting there. But the notion now that Europe has sold its soul to the devil, and the devil is America. NATO is not a European security alliance. It's not. NATO is an extension of American national security policy. NATO does what America wants it to do. That's why you were in Afghanistan. You weren't in Afghanistan because the Afghan threatened you. You're in Afghanistan because we told you to go there, and you followed. NATO is not there for the benefit of Europe, and it's time Europe start thinking about a European security framework. What's good for Europe? And I'll tell you what I think is good for Europe. Having guaranteed access to cheap gas that Russia provides. That's smart. That's good business. Russia's your neighbor. America's not. Come on, use your head.
No, I would just like just one sentence. Well, our prime minister was telling in his speech to the nation that basically Russia started the economic war against the trade war against Europe. But I think it's vice versa. I mean, Europe started the trade war against Russia because they were imposing the sanctions and they were, trying to stop everything. But I think it's a suicidal mission, because they're like, we cannot win. We don't have the gas. We don't have the oil. They have,
Yep. Look, it wasn't Putin that stared Joe Biden in the eyes in June 2021 in Geneva, saying, "I'm going to impose massive sanctions on you." It was Joe Biden that stared Putin in the eyes, and Joe Biden was speaking on behalf of NATO because NATO, after all, is America's little compliant poodle. So that's that. And I think we have to cut it here. I got to run. So we'll pick it up at 9 o'clock. I'll click on the same link.
Perfect.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you very
Thanks.
much.
Great. Thank you. Thank you.
See you soon.